So, hi, everybody. Glad that you could join us today. I think that we're going to have a wonderful meeting. Welcome to the first Wedgwood International Seminar welcome to the first WIS Zoom lecture of 2023. Thank you for joining us today for what I know will be a very interesting lecture. Matthew Winterbottom, today's speaker, is well known in the world of English ceramics. He is going to share with us his groundbreaking research on the work of Dr. Christopher Dresser. I would like to remind all of you that the lecture will be recorded and will join each of our previous lectures on the WIS YouTube channel. The new and vastly improved WIS website is one way to access these lectures. You will see in the chat box, there is a link to go directly to the website, but I can tell you that it is www.wedgwoodinternationalseminar.org. So don't worry about that. You can copy it from the chat box. If you would instead prefer to go directly to the videos on YouTube, the link for that, which again will also be in the chat box, is youtube.com/@Wedgwood International Seminar. And this lecture, this recording will be on, I don't know, in a week's time, give or take, and you'll be able to see that. But as I said, all of these links are now in the chat box. The website, the WIS new website, also conveniently will link you to the WIS Facebook page. The website can be accessed either on your smartphone, on your laptop, or on a desktop. When navigating the website, you will be able to learn about Wedgwood WIS events, how to become a member, how to support the organization, Wedgwood in the news, and even how to contact us. Lastly, there's a section on resources that lists both books and other English ceramic organizations. If you're not already a WIS member, why not consider joining? Since in addition to the Zoom lectures, other benefits include an annual in-person seminar in April, the scholarly proceedings, which are always have been edited by Dr. Ann Forschler-Tarish, and the fellowship of ceramic enthusiasts from around the world. You'll find a WIS membership application on the website. At the end of today's meeting, Ann will talk about this year's seminar, which will be held in April at the Birmingham Museum of Art in Birmingham, Alabama. And I am sure you will all want to hear all the details because I know some of the details and they're very exciting. The lectures are going to be fabulous. A quick word on how today's meeting will be conducted. Ann will be moderator. She will introduce our speaker, Matthew Winterbottom. The lecture will be followed with time for a question and answer session. So please remember throughout the lecture to type your questions, comments, whatever, into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. So now I would like to turn the meeting over to Ann, and I would just have one request. After the lecture and after the question and A session, stay tuned, don't hang up. There's more news. Ann, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Lorraine, and hello, everyone. It's great to see such a large group of a lot of friendly faces. So I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Matthew Winterbottom, who is Curator of Decorative Arts and Sculpture at the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University. So Matthew has over 30 years experience working with and researching European decorative arts. He started his career at the V&A as an assistant curator in the metalwork, furniture, and woodwork departments. And this was followed by 7 years as assistant curator of decorative arts at the Royal Collection, which must have been very exciting, where he co-curated several major exhibitions at the Queen's Gallery in Buckingham Palace. Then he moved on and became curator of decorative arts at the Holborn Museum in Bath, and he has been at the Ashmolean since March of 2014 as curator of 19th century decorative arts. But since January of 2017, he has been in charge of the entire Western art, sculpture, and decorative arts collections, which must be a lot of fun. He's currently working on a major exhibition of color in Victorian Britain, which will open at the Ashmolean in September of 2023. So please help me welcome Matthew Winterbottom. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those kind words and for the introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me today. It's a great sort of honor to be speaking to you all about a particular favorite of mine, Christopher Dresser. So let me share my screen. And right, I think that's right. I think we're there. Can you all see that? Good. Okay. Well, it's I thought it was rather, let me just, sorry, the screen isn't moving down. So excuse me a minute. For some reason, there we go. Sorry, it's all right. Moving. Okay, yes. Well, I thought it's very rather good timing that I'm talking about Dresser today, because actually, as many of you will know, next week on the 15th, the sale of the collection of Dr. Ellis and Suzanne Rubin is coming up. And within that sale, there are 3 rather wonderful pieces by Dresser. So some of you may be more interested in some of the earlier pieces, but for me, these are very exciting and very interesting pieces. So I'll come on to them a bit later, but these are the 3 pieces. This wonderful skate vase. Sorry, this extraordinary jardiniere, and this pair of jugs. And I'll come on and tell you a bit more about them in a bit later. But if you don't know Dresser, many people don't, or he's well known within certain fields and certain areas, and with curators and design historians. But not everyone has heard of Christopher Dresser. But actually, many of you will know him through some of his designs, which are still in everyday use. So, in fact, this is a famous Liberty print, and many of you will know this is from the Liberty catalogue. This peacock design here, well, feathers, and actually it's fairly recently been accepted that this actually is a Christopher Dresser design, which dates from 1876, called Hera, after the Greek goddess, and here the peacock's obviously in line with that wonderful sort of taste for peacock feathers within the aesthetic movement. So, people do know him, even though they don't necessarily know his name. But what he's really famous for, and what people mostly know him for today, are these kind of proto-modernist designs for metalwork, which were designed in the late 1870s and early 1880s. And again, I'll come on to those in a bit later. But there's so much more to him than these, admittedly, very remarkable designs. And here at the Ashmolean Museum here in Oxford, we're very lucky. We have 2 wonderful supporters in the US, actually, Barry and Dee Dee Wigmore, who are based in New York, and they're very heavily involved with the Metropolitan Museum there, but they are also great supporters of the Ashmolean, and they collect Christopher Dresser ceramics, mainly, particularly Linthorpe, which again I'll tell you a bit more about later on. And they very generously, back in 2016, gave us the pick of their collection to redisplay in our 19th century galleries. And this is a wonderful view of the gallery, the Dee Dee Wigmore Gallery, as it was renamed following the refurbishment. They allowed us to incorporate cases for the first time in that gallery to incorporate decorative arts. We have a very famous, very important collection of pre-Raphaelite paintings, but we didn't really have any 19th century decorative arts. And so we're busy building up that side of the collection, and particularly our Christopher Dresser collections, which have all come through Barry and Dee Dee. So this case at the front here, you can see is full of Christopher Dresser pieces, metalwork on the top, and then ceramics below, and really shows you the full range and extraordinary versatility of Christopher Dresser. Because, he really was an extraordinarily versatile designer. Now, he was rediscovered in 1936 by Nicholas Pevsner, who in his Pioneers of Modern Design, which is where my title comes from, rediscovered and wrote about Christopher Dresser, who died in 1904. And although he'd been extremely well known in his time, he rapidly disappeared from public consciousness, really, in the course of the 20th century. And it was only really in 1936 that he's rediscovered by Nicholas Pevsner, which is typical. He was obviously a kind of a German immigrant coming over into England, and he rediscovered him for the British. But again, that was very early on in 1936. one of the problems was in the 1950s, his two surviving daughters burnt all of his design notes. So very sadly, Christopher Dresser had seen them in the 1930s, but they weren't thought to be important at that time, and they were destroyed in a bonfire in their back garden in the 1950s. So none of his kind of extensive studio notes and designs survive from his own archive. So there is other material surviving in other archival collections, including Wedgwood, but nothing from his own archive survives because it was all destroyed by his daughters, very, very sadly. But really, come the 1960s, people again really rediscovered him, and it was really very much this proto-modernist designs, particularly for his metalwork, that people really responded to. They're kind of astonishing when you look at them. You think, well, actually, do these not date from the 1920s and the 1930s? And when you realise they're not from the 1870s, that is very remarkable. But I mean, they're not quite as straightforwardly proto-modernist as people would necessarily believe. I think, that actually has a very strong Japanese influence. And again, I'll tell you a bit more about that later on in the talk. But he became wildly fashionable really from the 1960s and the 1970s. Here are some of his designs that were recorded by Nicholas Pevsner in the 1930s when he visited the daughters very sadly before they were all destroyed in a fire. Now, the modern Italian company Alessi still make some of Dresser's designs here. So he's very much a kind of design hero amongst many contemporary designers, partly for these extraordinary, wonderful designs that he creates. And these plastic little bowls are based on this Elkington bowl from the 1880s, designed by Dresser, with this rather wonderful, it looks like somebody holding their hands on their sort of hips, rather a sort of comical design, I think. Really. So really, who is Christopher Dresser? And this is one of the best photographs we have of him. And there are only 2 photographs of Dresser, which is rather surprising, given he lived, from 1834 to 1904. He was only photographed that we know twice. And he's very much the first independent industrial designer, we like to think. He worked for a large and varied number of manufacturers in the UK, but also abroad as well. Now, the Studio magazine in 1899 described him as perhaps the greatest of commercial designers, imposing his fantasy and invention upon the ordinary output of British industry. He was born on the 4th of July, 1834, in Glasgow, although he wasn't Scottish, his parents were British, English, and he was an exact contemporary of William Morris. And like William Morris, he wished to improve domestic design and to make it available cheaply. Now, sadly, both failed. Morris spectacularly so in making cheap design available, whereas Dresser did manage to manufacture good design, but it was to a middle-class audience. Now, instead of the traditional field of the architect designer, such as Morris, of interior decoration and furniture, Dresser was very much a new breed of industrial-based designers, and for manufacturers in the UK, USA, France, and Japan. And in 1870, he wrote that, as an ornamentist, he often described himself as an ornamentist, I have much the largest practice in the kingdom. As far as I know, there is not one branch of art manufacture that I do not regularly design patterns for. Now, throughout his extensive publications of the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, he was the first really to explain design to the general public. But he was from a kind of lower middle class background, so very different to the kind of upper middle class background that Morris had. His father was an excise man, worked for customs and excise, but he had very precocious artistic talent. And in 1847, when he was only 12, he enrolled in the government schools of design. That was 2 years earlier than most other students at that time. But that was at Somerset House. So I should I'm sorry. This is the other photograph of Dresser in old age. So we have him as a young man and as an older man just towards the end of his life. Sorry, I'm just trying to work there we are. The Government Schools of Design. This is Government Schools of Design at Somerset House, which was set up in the 1830s for the purpose of effecting instruction to those engaged in the practice of ornamental art and for the preparation of design for the various manufacturers of this country. Now, these were set up in the 1830s very much for the British to try and compete, particularly with the French. Although the British were very good at making things, we were not very good at designing things, particularly artistic things. And the French kept winning lots of prizes and were consistently better and had a much better artistic training for the designers, for their manufacturers. So this was an attempt to try and train up industrial designers to create good design for the new manufacturing industries that were springing up all over Britain. Now, part of that was they were not, the new designers were not taught to, they were not considered artists, so they were not taught to draw the human body, for example. There was no life drawing. And actually Dresser writes about this. He says, that I was intended by nature as an artist, I do not doubt, but let it ever be remembered that with a view of causing me to become one, my parents placed me at a school of design, and as a consequence, I may not be an artist. And at this time, during the 19th century, designers were seen as inferior to artists and architects. You know, he's very much a kind of jobbing professional rather than the kind of gentleman architect or designer of someone like Morris or other great kind of architect designers at the time. But, you know, Dresser fought back. I mean, in the lecture to the Society of Arts in 1871, he wrote that true ornamentation is even a higher art than that practiced by the pictorial artist, as it is wholly mental in origin. So whilst he was at these government schools of design, he was taught by various leading artists, including William Dyce. This is a painting here of Rebecca at the Well by Dyce. And he assisted at the government schools of design because Dyce had seen similar schools in Germany, in Prussia. So these were very much based on continental sort of models of training up new designers. Now, under the system developed there by Dyce and others, students first studied geometry and then flowers and foliage. These were known as Dyce's outlines. And here we have some of Dyce's outlines. So you can see how students were taught to draw a kind of flat pattern in this sort of way. Dyce resigned in 1848 and Richard Redgrave became headmaster. And he really much saw the importance of the study of botany to the ornamentist. And this is what really first aroused, I think, Dresser's interest in botany. Redgrave believed that plants should be studied from nature before being transformed into symmetrical decorative ornaments. And fresh flowers were delivered from Kew Gardens to the government schools of design every week, and the students were then encouraged to draw and design from them. So here we have, some of Dresser's actual designs from nature. So you can see how he's taking natural forms and then trying to create kind of pattern out of those. And some more here. So this really encouraged him to really study in very close detail plants and animals. He also worked with Owen Jones, who was the architect and design theorist, who was pivotal in creating the South Kensington Museum with Henry Cole. Jones was probably the greatest influence on Dresser, and Dresser said he taught him how to think. And in 1856, The Grammar of Ornament was published by Jones, which is really the greatest colour book on decorative arts of the 19th century. And Jones wrote that flowers or other natural objects should not be used as ornaments, but conventional representations founded upon the sufficiently suggestive to convey the intended image upon the mind without destroying the unity of the object they are employed to decorate. So really that's very much about conventionalization or conventional ornament. This is something that was key to this government schools of design system of training designers, taking the natural flowers and then from that creating formal symmetrical ornament, flat ornament usually, that would then become a source for design. And this was very much pivotal in creating a new kind of 19th century style. And it was anti-Ruskin, really. So let me just go down here. So this is more of Dresser's design. These are Dresser's views of pollen grains here. And here we have more, so more of Dresser's design, seeing how he's taking a natural flower, this is Herb Robert, and then turning it into a kind of flat stencil-like flat pattern. Pugin was also doing this, and this is a wonderful Minton seat of the early 1850s with this kind of flat medieval style, conventionalized botanical ornament on it. Ruskin had a completely different theory about the natural world. He felt that nature should be reproduced in all of its minute detail rather than conventionalized. And in fact, he saw this as a kind of moral crusade against conventionalized ornament. And he was very anti this kind of approach. In fact, he blamed the Indian uprising of 1857 partly on India's use of conventionalized decoration and ornament, because actually, if you think of Indian designs, they're almost entirely conventional. They conventionalize sort of foliage. If you think of the very famous paisley decoration, for example, paisley ornament that's based on conventionalized vegetable ornament, which, as I say, Ruskin was completely against, because he felt the world should be shown as God's creation in all of its detail. Now, the government schools of design moved to Marlborough House in 1851, and Dresser really was very much an exceptional student in every case. He won many prizes, medals, and scholarships. And whilst at that school, he moved in the circle of Henry Cole, Pugin, and Owen Jones. And there were whole debates at that time about ornamentation and pattern and their relation to industry. And really, it's very much this search for a 19th century style that was happening at that time, a style that was appropriate for the 19th century. So here we have a sheet from, actually Dresser was asked to contribute to the grammar of ornament, and this is his sheet here, which is leaves and flowers from nature, again showing how natural forms can then be turned into flat, conventionalized pattern. Henry Cole, who of course has set up the V&A, what was to come the V&A Museum, he also set up something called Felix Summerley's Art Manufacturers in 1847, which united fine art with manufacturers. With Prince Albert, he was also key in starting in setting up the Great Exhibition of 1851. And you can see this is a much later tile by Dresser, a Minton tile, using that kind of using those principles that he learnt whilst he was a student at the government schools of design. You can see this is based on real actual plants, but actually they're then being conventionalized into a kind of formal pattern. He did believe actually that plants would grow symmetrically if they were just allowed with no interventions from the outside world. They would form perfectly symmetrical pattern, but of course, with the elements and insects and all those things, they change the course of how a plant grows. Jones famously, of course, was responsible for the color scheme inside the Crystal Palace. This is the Crystal Palace in 1851. Jones famously decided to paint the interior not white, as we often think, but actually primary colors of blue, yellow, and red, which, when seen from a distance, they would kind of merge into a kind of harmonious sort of haze, as you can see it's happening here. So I say Jones has this huge influence really on Dresser, and his color theories and his theories on design are, throughout Dresser's work, throughout his life. Probably the most famous British section of the Crystal Palace actually was Pugin's medieval court. So the British set up the Crystal Palace, the Great Exhibition, really very much to show off about how great British manufacturing and production was in the mid-19th century. And of course, the problem was actually the French and many other continental designers and manufacturers carried off all the prizes. But the one really successful section was Pugin's section here, the Gothic Revival medieval courts, which did include many objects with this conventionalized flat pattern, which is again based on nature, but also coming out of the kind of medieval tradition. The British, sadly, most of their sort of designs were more like this, based on the kind of this extreme naturalism, which many manufacturers had sort of plastered their sort of mass-produced objects with, which were very poorly received by many of the jurors when they were creating the art prizes for these for the manufacturers. And these are some particularly extreme examples of naturalism, extreme naturalism of the mid-19th century. Also at 1851 was a very large and very, very central India Court, which was founded and started by the East India Company. And it was very, very famous. People particularly responded to the beautiful fabrics that were on display there, and the very rich colors and harmonious kind of designs of the Indian fabrics. There was even a life-size stuffed elephant with kind of howdah and there, which really inspired people, particularly Dresser. He described himself as an earnest student of Oriental art, and his taste seems to be really awakened here when he visited the exhibition. He was particularly fascinated with color, and he did color experiments. He looked at things like soap bubbles and electric currents through gases to see the special color effects that he could then reincorporate into his designs. And he wrote that the sweetest harmony of colour is often close to discord. So sometimes we have quite extraordinary sort of colour combinations in Dresser's work. Jones went on to design the kind of historic courts at the Crystal Palace when it moved to South London. The Crystal Palace was very successful, so they dismantled it from Hyde Park in London and took it to South London and sort of extended it and made it into a permanent exhibition venue. And within it, there were various historic courts designed by Owen Jones, including the Egyptian court and the Alhambra court, for example. And these were very, very influential on Christopher Dresser when he was sort of learning and growing up. Really, they developed a new language of design based on this botanical abstraction, which I mentioned, and global eclecticism. So they were looking not only at the kind of natural world, but looking at the cultures of the past, so Egyptian, Roman, Renaissance, and then also cultures from non-Europe, so South American, African, Asian, Middle Eastern, for example, and they would all be combined together to create a new style for the 19th century. He finished school, this is Dresser, in 1854, and he had various posts teaching botany and some, as well as designing wallpapers and fabrics. And in 1855, he was actually appointed a lecturer at the School of Design. And he read a paper in 1857 called On the Relation of Science to Ornamental Art. He was a great believer in science, his scientific approach to art. And he also read a paper to the Linnean Society on the contribution of organographic botany. Again, so his first book was published in 1859 called The Rudiments of Botany. And in he wrote Unity in Variety as deduced from the vegetable kingdom. So this is again looking at this sort of botanical abstraction that I sort of mentioned earlier on. And it was in the same year that he was awarded his doctorate. So he was Dr. Christopher Dresser by the University of Jena in Germany, really for his work in botany. And he was very, very pleased with this. It was an exceptional honour and a non-academic education that he'd had. So he always used Dr. Christopher Dresser. It was a title he was very, very proud of. He actually applied for the chair of botany at University College in London in 1860, but he failed and didn't get it. So he then decided to concentrate on design, and his career in botany effectively was over by that time when he was aged only 28. He also, in 1861, he was always writing, and he was a great communicator to the public. He wrote something called The Art of Decorative Design, an article in the Building News on decorative design, indebted to Dyce's 1842 drawing book and Pugin's Floriated Ornament of 1849. And in that, he includes this very radical claim that the application of ornament to objects cannot be said to be absolutely necessary, which in 1861 was a really radical thing to say, actually, when you consider most 19th century design was really, usually quite heavily ornamented. To state that was really radical, but it wasn't really until the late 1870s that he really puts this into practice in terms of his quite radical modernist metalwork, as we consider it. The big moment for him was 1862, which was the great forgotten exhibition, I would argue, but actually for my work I'm doing on the colour exhibition coming up later on this year, it's a really important exhibition and was even bigger and probably more ambitious than the 1851 exhibition, but of course it could never live up to that initial excitement of the Crystal Palace, plus the fact that the poor old building was never as beautiful, so it was it was never appreciated and was quite rapidly demolished after the exhibition had closed late in 1862, so nothing survives from it. But actually Dresser was a very important designer, and he claims to have designed more things in it than any other designer at that time. So already by 1862, he has quite a large, extensive design practice where he's not just him, he's got many other designers working for him across different manufacturers in different materials, so textiles, metalwork, furniture, ceramics, for example. 62 is also important because, this is a wonderful view inside of it, showing this extraordinary sort of multicolored interior. But it was very important for Japanese works of art. Of course, Japan had only just opened up to the public, to the West, should I say, in the 1850s. It had been closed for well over 150 years, very little direct contact with Europe. and it's forced to open up in the mid-1850s, and contemporary Japanese works of art start trickling out. And they're shown publicly for the first time at 1862. And people are really completely transfixed by these wonderful contemporary Japanese works of art. These are some pieces that were acquired from 1862 by the South Kensington Museum. And Dresser really responded to this. And I'll come on to his, the importance of Japan to Dresser a bit later on. Showing you just how successful he was. This is the house he moved into in 1868. This is a Tower Cressy in Holland Park in London. Sadly, it doesn't survive. It was damaged during the war by bombing and then was demolished afterwards. But it was quite a remarkable Italianate kind of multi-story house within, Holland Park, which is this great area where many of the great sort of artists were living at this time. People like Lord Leighton were living all in this area. Although there's no evidence, I don't think, that he actually mixed in those circles. He was never quite part of that kind of artistic elite because he was, as they say, a commercial designer. So there was a kind of snobbery, and I think, and he was from a kind of fairly lower middle class background. So he's not from the same kind of social circle as many of these fine artists. But by 1869, I say a year after he moved in here, we know that he designed, for example, 158 silk damasks for a weaver in Halifax in England, and 67 carpets for Kidderminster. So it shows you just how productive and how many designs he was producing at this time. By 1871, 142 carpets designed. And for each of those designs, he was paid between 3 and 10 guineas, so just over a pound per design. So being paid very, very sort of well for these designs. Oops, sorry. Knowledge is power. This is one from his article, from his book, should I say, Decorative Design, The Art of Decorative Design, published in 1862, and this is one of the frontispiece from that, showing this remarkable sense of design and colour that he sort of had, and this knowledge is power. So this is something that the great tenet he believed in, and this was actually on his studio door. So these words. So this is very important. So, moving on to some of his more remarkable designs for Wedgwood. This is probably my all-time favourite piece by him, actually, and was thought to be completely unique, actually. This one's in the V&A, this one here, and its design was registered in March 1867, and it was shown at the Paris 1867 exhibition. So it's a kind of caneware body with this remarkable sort of design. And in the Principles of Decorative Design, which he published in 1873, he writes about this, and he says, "I have sought to embody chiefly the one idea of power, energy, force, or vigour. And in order to do this, I have employed such lines as we have in the bursting buds of spring, when the energy of growth is at its maximum, and especially such as are to be seen in the spring growth of luxuriant tropical vegetation. I have also availed myself of those forms to be seen in certain bones of birds, which are associated with the organs of flight, and which give us an impression of great strength, as well as those observable in the powerful propelling fins of certain species of fish." So it shows you how he's taking all these different elements and combining them into this kind of organic, but abstract organic sort of new decoration. Very, very distinctive and very, very sort of unusual, remarkable sort of designs, which I think are far more remarkable actually than many of his proto-modernist designs later on. Now, this was thought to be a completely unique example, but one actually turned up at there's the plate from the Principles of Decorative Design showing the kind of ornament that he was using on this. This is a Wedgwood piece, I should say. And then another one turned up actually in an auction, a kind of Welsh country auction back in 2014, and was sold for only £6,000, which seems remarkable. But that version is now in the Metropolitan Museum on long-term loan, which has just opened up a year or so ago, the new British Galleries, and there's a great display of Christopher Dresser ceramics in there, and you can see them there. And this version is now there. So there's one in the V&A and there's one in the Metropolitan Museum. I would love one for the Ashmolean, but sadly I think there are only 2 known. So unless another one turns up. This one was being used in a porch for umbrellas for many, many years before it was sold at auction. So it's a sort of a remarkable thing. This is another one of my particularly favorite designs in terms of what's extraordinary. This is the old bogey design, as he calls it. This is Minton, and in fact, Wedgwood, he did collaborate with Wedgwood and did designs for Wedgwood, but probably dresser designs for Minton are better known and more extensive than his work for Wedgwood. This is also from 1867, and we did have it on loan to the Ashmolean for a period of time. There is a version of it actually in the V&A and a version of it in the Metropolitan Museum again, but with different colorways, with a white or cream background. But particularly there's the cream background with the gold there. So you can see he's sort of basing this, I think, on insects and again fish and sea creatures and bones, but making these very, very strange, grotesque sort of creatures. I think probably responding to Japanese grotesque designs coming out again. He was collecting Japanese objects and Japanese prints and was clearly inspired by those as well. But he's completely crazy in its sort of origin and completely unlike anything else. To show how he was working across designs, this is a Webb pattern book. So this is cut glass. This is Webb's glass, Stourbridge glass, and this was from their archive. Somebody called Clive Manison sort of sent me this, showing this is for engraved glass with the same old bogey design. As far as I'm aware, none of those have ever been found. So if one turns up, that would be let me know. But they are particularly wonderful. And the other one, which is completely crazy, is Band of Brothers. This is this is from published in his books. As far as I'm aware, no one has come across a piece of ceramic incorporating this design yet. But this slightly crazy sort of abstract design. And I think I showed you earlier on the designs for pollen. This, I think, you can almost see how maybe cross sections of microscopic sections of plants or stems. You can see how maybe that's been sort of influenced some of this design here. And this one is a textile design by him based on frost on a window. You can see how he's taken that sort of frost pattern and then kind of abstracted it and turned it into kind of formal pattern, which I think is particularly beautiful, and this very, very spiky style that he's particularly well known for in the 1860s. And this is a Wedgwood this is a Minton spill vase, again sort of not quite inspired by the frost, but showing you that kind of very spiky design here. But here you can see this is the Frewster pattern book. It's in the V&A, and the Frewsters were varnishers and pattern makers and paint manufacturers in the UK, and their pattern book survives, and they have some original dresser designs in there which were used not only for their own work but for others. It seems to be an inspiration for them. It was acquired in the 1980s by the V&A, and the pattern book dates from between 1861 and 1868. And it's got 118 sheets of different designs by him, and wallpaper, chairs, designs for Minton, jugs and ewers in the Egyptian style. So it's quite an extraordinary resource. But some of the designs on these ones were clearly used by Minton and Wedgwood in some of their designs. Now there's a coloured one for you. You remember there's one coming up for sale. This is actually not that one. This is the one that was presented to us in 2016 by Barry and Dee Wigmore. So I was very, very pleased to have our own Wedgwood skate vase. And this is probably one of the most remarkable sort of skate vases. I think it's based on, well, clearly looking at natural ornament, but also I think possibly based on Japanese ceramics as well, sort of combining together this kind of flat fish vase or skate vase here. So this is our one. This is the one coming up. You can see how the designs were sometimes varied. This is the one that's coming up in the Rubin sale next week, particularly wonderful. And here, I'm afraid the V&A has not digitized its Wedgwood pattern books yet. So I've had to take these out of the Maureen Batkin's Wedgwood Ceramics 1846 to 1959, which has black and white reproductions taken from the Wedgwood design book, showing some of the dresser designs for Wedgwood. And this is clearly the fish vase, or the flat fish vase or skate vase. And it's with a Flemish background. This is this kind of terracotta coloured background with the enamelled kind of decoration on top of it. And then you'll see in the bottom here, you can then see this other hanging vase. Two versions here. This one on the left is again illustrated in Batkin. The one on the right was sold back in 2014 from the John Scott collection. So these are again both Wedgwood pieces, and these are some of the most remarkable pieces, and clearly based on sort of looking at Egyptian style decoration as well, I think, although not quite Egyptian. You know, it evokes some Egyptian, but then you've got this kind of organic decoration, which clearly based on birds' bones and fishes' fins, and then maybe plant stamens. That thing in the center looks almost like it's a cross section of a flower, I think, you know, so he's combining them all together in these kind of new and exciting ways. I should say the flatfish, our one is 1867, and the one that's coming up for sale next week is 1872. And there's another use of that pattern. This is a slightly later design from Wedgwood for a jug, but also using this kind of skate, stylized skate pattern here, but again combining it with some kind of Egyptian sort of lotus style decoration there on the side, but also, you know, using it in a completely different way. This is an undated one, which is also coming up for sale next week, and you can see the form is the same with the skate. So not only is the decoration on the side of the other ones a fish, but actually the form of the entire vase is a fish with the open mouth and the eye. This one then slightly destroys that by then covering the whole thing in this kind of prunus or japonica decoration, which was first registered in 1873, this pattern. So this is clearly after 1873, and you can see the pattern then is used again with the japonica on the left with the orange, but it's also used in underglazed kind of blue as well. So you can see on the right. The one on the left there is in the Fitzwilliam Museum. Another one of the famous designs for Wedgwood is the Aquarian tureen here, not tureen, sorry, jardinier here. Another quite extraordinary design by Dresser for Wedgwood, and again comes in a variety of colorways. So this is the one we have in our collection, which the Wigmore's presented to the Ashmolean. This is another one that was sold at Bonham some years ago, so you can see completely different. And how much control that Dresser had on the colorways, I'm not sure. He's designing these things, and I think, you know, the manufacturers themselves would then vary the colors and change them. But it shows flying fish, and then they're sort of trying to eat a sort of beetle in the middle, and then they're sort of hung up by the tails. It's a very strange sort of combination of patterns and designs. But again, this is taken from Batkin's reproduction from the Wedgwood design books, which show this pattern again here. So you can see Dresser's design. Another tureen here. This is again the one coming up for sale, and the Rubin sale next week. And again, I think you can see how Dresser sometimes his designs were applied to fairly conventional shapes. I don't think Dresser designed this shape. Certainly, he designed the applied ornament and decoration, but not the actual those those handles and the shape. I think is very undresser. And here is the design book showing the shape there with those various different designs applied to it, and with the borders there, these kind of Egyptian style borders. Oops, sorry. As I say, sadly, they've not been digitized, these things, but actually Max Donnelly, who's produced last year, he wrote an excellent book about Dresser, produced through the V&A. He includes one of the sheets from the Wedgwood design books, which includes this kind of bird-like pattern, which you find on the side of the you know, this here. And that's a close-up. I'm sorry, it's not a very good slide, but I had to blow it up from the book, I'm afraid. But you can sort of see how these patterns were being cut. So they're all beautifully coloured, but I said we don't have colour illustrations yet. So hopefully the V&A will get on and digitize those collections. Also coming up in the Rubin sale are these two jugs, and again, I don't think the jug, you know, these are the Doric jugs. But they have these Wedgwood kind of Egyptian style borders on the side, and these quite startling colors as well. These sort of lime green, sort of pink and blue with gold on there. So it's showing you again how Wedgwood were using some of Dresser's designs on quite conventional shapes as well, not just on kind of these radical shapes that he was designing. And here again, you can see some of the borders here, which show you this is a nice digitized version, which the V&A did have, and we're able to send in, showing you these lovely sort of detailed border designs. And you can see here how they're sort of being then lifted and put onto different jugs. So that's his work really for Wedgwood. His collaborations with Minton was far more extensive. And what he's particularly famous for, I think, with Minton is this so-called cloisonne ware. These are two pieces in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which date from the 1870s, where he's using ceramic to evoke metal cloisonne enamels, particularly Chinese and Japanese enamels, and very, very successfully and extremely sort of colourful and sort of gorgeous things. I have to say they're wonderful, and sometimes in the case of these two, he's quite close to looking at Asian designs, particularly on the left. You might think that actually was a Chinese object actually, but then he also then incorporates new pieces, and this is probably one of my other all-time favorite pieces, which is in the Baltimore Museum of Art, this quite large tureen, and showing you how he's using the same technique to evoke these Oriental, sort of Chinese and Japanese cloisonnes, but then incorporating his kind of love of nature. So these extraordinary beetles and butterflies and stylized plants. And it's an extraordinary object, this, and it's a very big piece and very, very powerful when you see it. Oops. Yeah, and you can see again with these, when you first look at these two, these are in the Metropolitan Museum. When you first look at them, you might think, oh, they're copying Chinese forms. When you look more closely, you see they're not. The form is a double Chinese vase, but actually it's got hummingbirds on it. Well, hummingbirds are not a Chinese motif. They're a South American feature. And then that extraordinary sort of abstract green stripe in the middle. I mean, it's almost like again, it's not based on anything Chinese, and he's bringing in all these different influences together to create these new and extraordinary pieces. This is another piece in our collection. His love of beetles and insects was, I think he was always using the natural world in his work. And so this has a 3D model of a beetle on the side. This again is Minton. This dates from the 1867, that sort of date. There's a number of them surviving from the late 60s to the early 70s with these beetles, and you can usually get them in this kind of bright turquoise color or pink. It's obviously based on a Chinese double gourd shape, but then has this beetle on the side, which is unlike anything you would get in sort of China or Japan, although of course they do use beetles in their art. And this one has this extraordinary face on the side. You can see it's almost like a sort of South American, Central American Aztec kind of feel to it. Although actually it's based, I think, on these beetles. These are called man-face beetles. These are real beetles that you get from Indonesia. And I think he must have come across them, which is why he's incorporating funny faces on the back of his beetles in some of his designs. But these are real insects that again, I think he must have been aware of when he was incorporating that into his sort of design. Now, he didn't just work for ceramics. He was working across the fields and what was special about Dresser is he was able to know how objects were made. He embraced mass production, knew how the techniques worked, and then designed to that. So, very much very different to Dresser, to Morris, who rejects mechanization, rejects mass production. Dresser realizes if you want to bring good design to the masses, you need to embrace mechanization and industrialization. So he embraces all the modern techniques and then designs to them. And this is a good example. This is Colebrookdale, a late 1860s kind of hall stand, using cast iron in this beautiful sort of very spiky kind of aesthetic sort of taste that he sort of develops in the 1860s. He also designed furniture as well, and this is another particularly fun object, which is in the V&A, which was designed. Where are we? Sorry, hang on. Let me find it. It's from Bushlow House, which was designed in 1874 for a solicitor friend of his. And it's in a kind of mix. So he designed the whole house in a mix of Japanese, Egyptian, and Persian styles. And this is from the bedroom. And clearly, you can see he's been inspired by Japanese sort of prints. I think these rather fun frogs or toads that are sort of frolicking all over the front of this extraordinary wardrobe. He also designed a place in. So there's only two surviving houses designed by him. There's Allen Gate in Halifax and Bushlow House in Leicester. So these two sort of northern British kind of cities where but sadly, most of the contents don't survive from those houses. Now, in 1870, he produced and published The Principles of Decorative Art, which began as a series of articles in the Technical Educator. So he's very much writing for the kind of working man, the working designer. This is when he's writing these articles. It's for that kind of audience that he's writing for. and that was pulled together in book form in 1873. And from 1874, he starts using his signature, which is very very, very radical at this time. So on his metalwork and on his ceramics, they start bearing the signature of Christopher Dresser, or Dr. Dresser sometimes, and this was really to use his signature as a brand, or to prove to the kind of middle classes that were buying his designs, that were buying good design. It's all about design, good design reform. So, if you've got Christopher Dresser on the bottom, this is the height of his kind of fame, the height of his sort of influence, I would say, the kind of 1860s, 1870s. So people, could buy pieces, and they would recognize Dr. Dresser's sort of signature on the bottom. So this has not been done before. Obviously, artists had signed their work on paintings or whatever, but not really on objects like this. So this is a kind of a new departure. And there's, this is some from the late 70s, early 80s. This is Linthorpe, again, with his actual facsimile signature on the bottom. Now, in 1876, he travels to Philadelphia. This is the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition of 1876, a particular favorite of mine, a really fascinating sort of exhibition. And he travels there and is lauded when he arrives. He delivered 30 designs for various designers in the US. And the New York Times described his arrival as one of the most perfect specimens of art intellect which England shipped to the United States for exhibition at Philadelphia. So he's very well received, and obviously he's quite well known by the time he arrives in Philadelphia. And so he comes and works for some designers whilst he's out there. He then uses this trip to carry on to go to Japan, and then travels on to Japan, arriving there in December of 1876, and he's the first really the first Western designer, I think, to travel to Japan. And he was there on official business. He was delivering the official gift of the British to Japan as the official representative of the South Kensington Museums, who had gone there. And he was also appointed special advisor to the Japanese government on trade with Europe, an emissary of South Kensington Museum, as well. So, it's quite an important sort of role that he had. Not only was he visiting and viewing Japan, and he had virtually unrestricted access to the country, which it was really in the final stages of traditional life. The Satsuma Rebellion was going on as he was traveling around Japan at that time. And over 4 months, he traveled 1,700 miles. He visited 68 potteries, 100 temples, took 1,000 photographs, and acquired over 8,000 pieces of objects for Tiffany. He was actually an agent for Tiffany and was buying things for Tiffany whilst he was in Japan for them to bring back to sell. And his designs on his return become much more authentic and much more authentically Japanese. He's completely inspired by his visit there. He was actually an honored guest of the emperor and was received by the Mikado. So, it was actually quite an important sort of guest, and on his return he was invited to Marlborough House to see the Prince and Princess of Wales, for example. So when he gets back, he then publishes various books on his experiences in Japan, and he published The Art Manufactures of Japan, Some Personal Observations in 1878, and Traditional Arts and Crafts of Japan in 1882, and Japan, its Architecture, Art and Art Manufacturers in 1882 as well. And these are very important, wonderful descriptions, incredibly still extremely useful publications that are well worth reading if you haven't read them. And on his return, he set up a wholesale importer firm in Kobe in Japan with his sons who were based out there. So, he retains these very strong links with Japan. And now his principles of fitness for purpose and honesty of form, which is something which Pugin had been talking about as well, became even more marked on his return back from Japan. And after Japan kind of almost rejects ornament, with this emphasis on quality of material and actually emphasizing the methods of manufacturing. And this is, I think, why many design historians get very excited by his work. This purity of form predicts kind of modern design later on in the 20th century. And in 1878, he got a contract to design silver and silver plate for Hewkin and Heath of Birmingham, these big silver plate manufacturers. Let me just calm down. So I should just say this is rather a wonderful view from Philadelphia, showing the bit of the Statue of Liberty before to raise funds to finish the rest of it. So Hewkin and Heath, but actually it's in 1879 when he does work for James Dixon and Sons in Sheffield, where the really radical metalwork designs sort of start appearing. So this is one of them. This is a teapot. But actually this broke all of his own rules. Although they look super proto-modern, actually they're very difficult to make and they were not economical to make. And in fact, that goes against his kind of principles of good design for manufacturers. So they look like they should be kind of proto-modernist, but actually they weren't terribly successful and not that many were made actually. But he also shows his interest, I think, in ergonomic design. You can see how the shape of the handle and how that sort of fits. And he was very carefully thinking about all these things at that time. But what's radical, of course, about this is there's no applied ornament on this object at all. It's based on form alone and function. Another one of his famous Dixon toast racks, again, which are still in production today. I mean, the modernist classics. I mean, completely. And as you can imagine, these were completely radical when they first came out. A bit too radical, I think, for many people. People didn't quite know how to receive them. And what he also designed, he designed in a range of materials. So you could either buy them, in solid silver if you wanted, or you could have them in silver plate. There was a sort of economy of what according to your budget, you could get them in different price levels, and more here. So with something like this, for example, you can see how he has used his knowledge of how the stamping of metal sheets to make this object. And then use that for decorative effect by curling in the edges and making this kind of curled handle. So he's used a completely mass-produced object, but made no compromise in terms of adding ornament or anything like that. It's all based on how it's been made. It affects the decoration or the shape of the object. So it's a very radical object from that perspective. This is the Cordafan. So they were the precious metal pieces. This is japanned copper, and this is made by Richard Perry and Sons, Birmingham, in 1883. Another radical form. This was retailed through Liberty. So Liberty, the great sort of artistic department store in London, which was selling Japanese silks and Indian carpets and other design reformed objects, were also selling this Cordafan candlestick, in these kind of artistic colors, these kind of often quite muted tertiary colors that were kind of fashionable with the aesthetic movement. And again, with this wonderful sort of, what's the word, ergonomic handle, because this is obviously a kind of chamber candlestick, but carrying around. Let me do time. And then we've got here, in 1879, he worked with the Linthorpe art pottery. So the Linthorpe art pottery was set up in Middlesbrough, which was a depressed part of northeast England, by John Harrison, who was a local landowner who had some access to brick clay, and he worked with Dresser to really set up an art pottery, excuse me, to give work to unemployed miners in the area. And Dresser designs a whole range of pots in these radical sort of styles, which to our mind today may not look that radical, but when these first came out in the 1870s, nothing else had really been done like that before in Europe, and they went on to become extremely sort of fashionable and influential. In fact, they were copied so extensively that the Linthorpe factory then closes in the late 1880s. Excuse me. Now, for his inspiration, you can see how Dresser is using Japanese and Chinese forms, but also many other forms as well. So this is clearly based on a sake bottle. He was also, designing the forms and then leaving the glazers to the factory workers. And Henry Tooth, who was working at the Linthorpe factory, was doing some rather radical experiments with glazers at this time. So many of the pieces are of the same form, but the glazes would be completely different, and that enabled you to have a very kind of varying artistic output. Even though these things were semi-mass produced, they would have very different glaze effects for the same form. Excuse me. And you can see here how he's mixing in his different influences, an incredibly sort of eclectic world sort of influence in some of the forms that the Linthorpe pottery were making in the 1880s. And these things were not super expensive. Again, they were aimed for a kind of middle class middle-class market. This sort of bridge-spouted vessel really doesn't really have a practical use. Clearly, he's basing the form on pre-Columbian kind of forms here. So you can see this sort of South American, Central American clay forms, but they're not slavish copies. And then he's mixing in naturalism at the same time. And these bridge-spouted forms were very popular for some of the linthorpe shapes. This one here, you can see, has but it's actually based on a kind of natural sea urchin shell, but then he's given it this South American bridge spout, as it were. And these camelbacked or humpbacked forms, again, were very popular, and they can vary in their decoration. And with these glazes, and the glazes were often left to do their own thing and to work in the kiln. You can see how this one has run, give you these artistic effects, which again give you variation. Even though these things were made in molds and were semi-mass produced, they could look very, very different. You can see here there's a selection of three. Oh, so two, just two. So I had three. Excuse me. The other forms that he's doing is South American. He's using kind of all Asian forms, and then this is ancient Anatolian. This beak-spouted form was also a form that he took from ancient Anatolian things. So this is actually a piece in our own collection, but shows you how he was really very, very eclectic. And that's really his education, I think, at the Government Schools of Design with Owen Jones. He taught to look across and to pick what he liked from across different cultures. This is a linthorpe piece on the left. It's an ashtray, a rather sort of extraordinary sort of ashtray form, and it's based on a Fijian ceremonial vessel on the right here. But you see what he's done, he's taken off the hands so you can put the cigarettes where the hands and the feet should be. And then he's given the figure a kind of Japanese face. So again, he's not slavishly copying. He's really playing around. Excuse me. I got rather a nasty cold. Sorry, let me just carry on. He also worked with Watcombe in Devon. So down in Devon, down near Torquay, in the 1860s, there was discovery of clay in that sort of area and near Watcombe House and the Watcombe factory. Although there's no actual direct evidence that Dresser worked for Watcombe, the designs produced by Watcombe in the 1870s and the 1880s clearly were designed by him, and nobody else, I think, could have designed these sorts of forms. This is a good example of that, using this kind of red Devon clay. With these very angular, very distinctive forms that that Dresser was working with for Watcombe, and you get this kind of this kind of very spiky functionalism being made by Watcombe, but also quite close copies of Chinese and Japanese forms as well. So here we have a little teapot, again a Watcombe teapot, imitating really I Ching Chinese stoneware, but made in this terracotta. And these things were very much made as sort of objects for the new kind of Victorian middle class holiday makers who are going down to the south coast, down to Devon. So you get quite a lot of this. It survives today. You can come across quite a lot of Watcombe designs, which clearly were designed by Dresser. These pieces do not bear his signature, I should say. It's the metalwork, and it's the Linthorpe factory in Middlesbrough that does have his signature. Oops, sorry. But just to show you how he's designing across patterns here. Here we have this is what date is this? I'm trying to remember. So this is a 1884 silver made in Birmingham, but clearly of the same pattern. So designed to, Dresser is designing in terracotta, but also in silver as well. So rather nice, and how these designs can go across. But I say he's not just he would have known how these things were all made. He wasn't actually just designing something and expecting the designer to the company then to work out how it's made. He also knew how that would work. In 1889, Linthorpe closed down, partly because I think many other companies were beginning to copy this technique, and copying the kind of glaze effects and this kind of artistic pottery. So they were undercut, and they were not, they're no longer financially successful. But some of the molds were bought by the Alt factory in South Derbyshire, and continued making some of the Linthorpe forms. But also in the early 1890s, Dresser then goes on to produce a whole range of new designs, which are probably some of his most remarkable designs, I would say, for the Alt factory. Less exciting glaze effects, I would argue, but actually these extraordinary designs here. This is probably the weirdest and most wonderful one, which shows it's the tongue vase. So here there's these heads going around, and the tongues are coming out, and they're trying to go into the vase. I think they're probably thirsty. This is the idea. Now, again, this form is taken loosely from a Japanese shape, but nothing quite like this is made in Japan. So he's taking inspiration and then rethinking it and rejigging it completely in a new way, which only really Dresser could do. He'd also set up in 1881 the Art Furnishers Alliance. So this was a specialist, it was on a shop that he set up on New Bond Street. And it was too ahead of its time, sadly. It was really bringing together art manufacturers. So this idea that everything had to be beautiful, that you would have everything in your house had to be well designed and beautifully made. He set up an entire sort of company to do this, but it was just too, I think, far ahead of its time, and it closed after a couple of years. And he went back to kind of jobbing designing after that point, really. I mean, he does these designs for the Alts in the early 1890s. And some more ones here. This is the goat vase with the monopodia, sort of feet. And these are, again, all in the Ashmolean Museum, so you can come and see these. These are sort of the owl vase, again, sort of owl at the bottom. And again, the shape is based on Chinese forms, I think, but then he's combined it in a completely different and new way. And one of my particular favorites, these are for fireplaces, I think, in the summer when a fireplace was not being used. This is a peacock, and then it's got little holes. It's a vase, and there are little holes around the edge, and you can put actual peacock feathers in it. So this would look like your own peacock, which would fill the kind of empty fireplace when you're not using it. So that kind of life-size sort of peacock in your room. And again, they come in all sorts of different glaze combinations, but these quite shocking combinations of colors. You can see here this kind of red and the green together, and this very deliberately sort of streaky effect. These are again all made by Alt in the kind of 1890s. Old Hall was a sort of another Staffordshire company that he also designed for in the 1890s and sort of 1880s. Not so successful, I would argue, in terms of some of his designs. I mean, completely radical and completely strange, but I don't know how aesthetically sort of successful these pieces are. This is from a jug and bowl set, and it's a kind of bow tie shape. I mean, it is truly extraordinary in terms of its shape. This is it from 1881, but just to show you, I think, how ahead of his time he was. These are Myatt's and Sons and Co. from the 1930s designs, 50 years after that was made, showing, I think, how, just how ahead of his time. And certainly, the more I look into it, the more I find kind of 1930s designs, they've clearly been inspired by Dresser and clearly have copied them or changed them. But I think this is a good example of that. He also, in the 1890s, is involved with the Clutha Glass project. So John Cooper and Sons of Glasgow, between 1888 and 1900, set up the Clutha Glass factory, making this really expensive and very finely made handmade glass. Clutha is the ancient Roman name for the river god of the River Clyde in Glasgow. And this glass was a deliberate evocation of ancient Roman glass. So it was kind of bubbly and hand blown, but also included lots of kind of gold powder. So it had this aventurine sort of effect to it. It was very, very expensive and was retailed exclusively through Liberty. So it's very ethereally beautiful, but completely unlike anything else. And again, I think shows you just how versatile Dresser was. I mean, these forms are unlike all the other forms that you've sort of come across so far. And there was a brief moment in the 1890s where he's designing this. But after this, he kind of reinvents himself as an Art Nouveau designer, really moves. I think this shows you just how ethereally beautiful some of the Clutha glass is. You can see this lovely gold. You can probably just see the gold flecks within the glass of this piece. They often have the Clutha acid etch mark underneath you, so you can recognize them. But in the late 1890s and early 1900s, he kind of reinvents himself again as a kind of Art Nouveau designer. So this is a fabric from 1899 designed by him. This is in the V&A. Completely different, moving completely away from that very spiky aesthetic kind of 1860s, 1870s style that we particularly associate with him. And I think if you saw this, you wouldn't think it was Christopher Dresser. But he was working right up until the end. He died of a heart attack, age 70, in Mulhouse in France, whilst working with a wallpaper manufacturer out there. So he was already still designing. So he still had a big successful workshop in 1904. But his achievement really by the time he died was that he pioneered the profession of the industrial designer and finding radical solutions in advance of any of his other contemporaries. And he could understand the properties of the materials that he was designing for and the manufacturing processes. So that, this is why he's considered the modern kind of father of industrial design. And he was very optimistic, unlike Morris, about the industrial future. He didn't have the same kind of moral panic that Morris had about people working in factories. So he embraced the machine and embraced mass production and made no excuses for that. But what happened was, the reason he was forgotten about is because actually in Britain it was the arts and crafts and William Morris whose legacy continued, even though in industrial design actually Dresser is far more important. The Morris is a slight sort of I would argue it's a slight sort of distraction from what really is going on. But it's only really until the 1960s that he's rediscovered again, and people really appreciate what he'd done and how ahead of his time he'd been. So I hope that was a sort of good overview and introduction to Dresser. And so apologies for my coughing fit. I've got a bit of a cold, but I hope it was, if you don't know Dresser, I hope it's opened up your eyes to him and shown you just how wonderful and extraordinary he is and can be. But thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. That was fantastic. Very interesting. We do have some questions in the chat, so we'll get right to them. Will there be a published catalog for the exhibition you're working on now on color in Victorian Britain? Are you doing a catalog?
There will, absolutely, there will be one.
Great.
And yes, I'm working on that at the moment. And so, yes, and we will have, Dresser will be in there actually as well. So, because he's very influenced, I should have said, in terms of color, Chevreul, who is the great French chemist who's produced his theories on color harmonies in the 19th century. This was a new idea that why colors work together and don't work together, and this is something that Dresser really subscribed to. So we are including him, including pieces from him according to those Victorian ideas of color harmony and primary, secondary, and tertiary colors, and what sort of combinations were allowed in order to produce a harmonious kind of color design.
Yeah,
but yes, that will be coming out. So the exhibition opens in the end of September. So the book will be out at the same time. Absolutely. So do come and see it. It's going to be quite a wonderful show, I have to say.
Yeah, that's great. We'll look forward to that catalog. Next question. Did Dresser design the shapes for Wedgwood as well as the patterns? I know you alluded that.
I think it depends. So the fish form, yes, definitely. That's a Dresser design, absolutely. That Jardiniere, I think not. That dolphin handle thing, I don't think he's designing that. Although I think he's so versatile, and because it's not just him. He's got a workshop, so he's perfectly capable probably of producing that, but it just doesn't quite feel. I think what you find with Dresser sometimes is that the pattern, the more radical pattern, is then applied to a more conservative pre-designed body, and that's, I think, what is the case in that sort of Jardiniere with the dolphin handles. I think it's a slight mismatch between the kind of decoration and the form, I think, piece.
Yeah,
but yeah, I think it's both really. You can find can find sometimes his forms and sometimes not.
All right, thank you. Is there a contradiction between Dresser's work with Minton and Wedgwood and with art pottery, or is there a thread woven in that we can tease out?
That's an interesting one. I think, the thing is, it depends Linthorpe is a kind of art pottery, but it's still mass produced. So it's certainly something that he's, it's not like the handmade piece, even though it's evoking the kind of handmade pieces of maybe Japan or something like that. And he's very responsive to that. Yes, I mean, some of those Minton and Wedgwood pieces predate his visit to Japan, which has a big influence on his work later on, which is why the Linthorpe is so different, I would argue, to some of the stuff that he's producing earlier on for the big manufacturers. And I suppose they're less willing, perhaps, to make to do those experimental glaze effects, for example, in the big companies like Wedgwood or Minton, which Linthorpe really specialised in, and to a lesser extent the sort of Alt factory as well. But yes, it's all. I mean, yes, it's all good design. It's all the idea that, you know, what is art pottery anyway? You know, this idea that you know, some of those designs from the 1860s are still design reform. You know, this is what Dresser is doing. It's all part of that movement to produce good design, to move away from bad design, and for him, you know, that is producing good design for mass production, and so it's all part of that kind of same artistic movement. And, you know, the Art Furnishers Alliance, the house that he's, you know, this department store in effect that he sort of opens up in 1881, is very much to do that. It's to produce the house beautiful, you know, to produce the kind of objects that your artistic middle class would want to live with, even though they may be semi or mass produced.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
I don't think there is a contradiction. I think there is, you know, they're all part of the same moment, really. I think, although they do look, admittedly, very different. Yeah. I think the Linthorpe is deliberately trying to look handmade. I think that's the thing, you know, through the kind of effect.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Julie, Julie Hughes out there, I just saw your second message, so apologies for that. Next question. Do many of Dresser's actual drawings or his original designs still remain with Minton and at the Wedgwood archives?
Yes, so they do, absolutely. So particularly the Wedgwood, all the pieces I showed you, they're all from the Wedgwood archive. So it hasn't been digitized yet. So the V&A are getting round to doing that. So I had to take them from, yeah, but they are with that, and similarly with Minton. So they do. But I say what we don't have are his side of it. So the notes and the archive from his own workshop. That was all destroyed, very sadly, in the 1950s by his daughters, even though Pevsner had seen it in the 1930s when he visited them. But nobody thought it was important by that date, and they just seemed to have burnt it in the back garden, which was heartbreaking, really, because that would have really shown, I think, the extent of his workshop. Because, you know, because we don't know for sure, you know, you can see all these pieces and you think, well, that looks quite Dressery, or that looks quite Dressery, but sometimes it's hard to be absolutely certain, particularly some of the companies we don't know. I mean, he says he's designing all these, you know, designing for many different manufacturers, but we don't always have a record of who they are. So we just have to look and stylistically look at his designs and think, are they consistent with what we think Dresser would be doing? There has been a bit of a tendency to kind of anything with a bit of a spiky sort of zigzag effect, you know, to sort of attribute it to Dresser, and that's not always the case. I think people can be a bit overzealous sometimes in seeing Dresser everywhere, you know, so I mean, Watcombe is a good example. He must have designed for Watcombe, but we don't have any documentary evidence that he designed for Watcombe. I think that's the sort of it's purely
that's too bad. I didn't realize that was all destroyed by his family. That's kind of a bummer.
I mean, this happened a lot, you know. This happened a lot before.
Oh yeah.
So, you know, it's just tragic.
Yeah, that is. So here's a question, and I'll just paraphrase. So how do contemporary companies like Alessi, how do they get Dresser's designs, or how are they able to reproduce them?
Well, that's interesting.
Are they all in the public domain, or is there a...
I don't actually know for that. I imagine they must be, because it's a long, I mean, he died in 1904, so they're no longer, I mean, I think they're probably not patented. Mind you, Elkington is still, you know, so I don't quite know about that. Maybe they have to be produced on sort of... There may be well, I actually don't know. I'm not sure, because yes, certainly that famous sugar bowl, you know, is which they probably have had to sort of pay a kind of reproduction fee for using that. I mean, what's interesting about that is the bowl itself is when you read Dresser and his kind of principles of design, you know, actually it's very much made for metal, because actually the shape of the form has a ring, a band running around it, and that band is put into the metal when you stamp the metal out to enable you to use the thinnest metal possible. And if you stamp in a band, it strengthens the shape of the metal. So it means it'll be cheaper to produce because you're using less thickness of metal, but it also adds a kind of decorative band. But the metal band also provides stability and strength. So it's that use again, which doesn't really hold true, I think, for a plastic piece, the Alessi piece. It's slightly, I think it's probably made in a different way. I'm sure Alessi are not making it according to Dresser's principles, where he knew exactly how,
Yeah.
a metal piece would be stamped out using the machinery, and in order to strengthen that, designs it accordingly. So it's slightly against, I think, I would argue, his own principles of good design.
Yeah.
For manufacturing.
I'm sure. Did Dresser ever collaborate with James Powell and Sons, Whitefriars Glassworks?
Not that I'm aware, no. Although again, we don't know for sure. So, similarly for Worcester, the Royal Worcester, I think he must have produced, again, we don't have any evidence, but there are some designs that seem to be certainly inspired by Dresser. But again, the other question is, what is is he deliberate, is he directly working with them, or is he actually just designing, or other designers being inspired by him? That's the other thing, of course, that could be the case.
Yeah, and you have a lot of messages in the chat about what a fantastic talk it was. So thank you very much. But there is one final question, and then we'll leave it at that. Is there any link between Dresser's work and the designs of Walter Teague and Raymond Loewy in the 30s in the US designers?
Well, that's a big question, I think, about, how much did the modernists know of Dresser? I certainly think, he's forgotten about, really. I think people really do forget about him until Pevsner comes along in 36, but there are already designs happening by that date. So, but these things must have been hanging around. People must have, there must have been people seeing these things. And so, but as far as no one has satisfactorily answered that for me so far. I don't know for sure, what the direct influence is. I think, people, when you see those designs, those metalwork designs, you think, oh gosh, they really are, proto, they are precursor to modernism. But when you realize he's been to Japan and it's the Japanese influence, you really see that in them, actually. I think more than the modernist kind of idea, I think, possibly. And I think people sometimes get slightly sidetracked by that. And forget that it really is the influence of Japan that has this big massive effect on him. But he's radical. He's the one that says you don't need to have ornament on an object, which is very radical for the 19th century.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Matthew, for your lecture today. It was fascinating, very interesting, and we all learned a lot.
Well,
So,
go and
appreciate it.
come and see the collection at the Ashmolean, and come and see the exhibition as well, which would be great.
Yeah,
Thank you
would
very
love
much
to
for
do
having
that.
me. It's been a
Look
pleasure.
forward to that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And everyone, I'm just going to say a few words about the Wedgwood International Seminar, which is taking place at the Birmingham Museum of Art, April 27th through 29th. And attendees will have the opportunity to see our behind the scenes, some of the objects that we have in storage, look through our library, our many Wedgwood library and archival holdings. And we also have a fantastic lecture program. We'll have 7 lectures total, and they include, and I'm going to pull up my list here. So Wedgwood designed a service for Fath Ali Shah Qajar, who was a Persian Shah, and we have some pieces in our collection. And so we will have a lecture about that. It's actually a really fascinating story of how that was ordered and commissioned for the Shah. We also will have lectures on the Portland vase by Rachel Gottlieb, who I think is somewhere on this lecture. She's doing an exhibition about the Portland vase. Ornamental Wedgwood wares in China in 1793 is another topic. Peter Pincus, who's a contemporary artist, will come and talk about how he uses Wedgwood, the legacy of Wedgwood today in his own work, but also in his teaching. And he's a really fun speaker and fun guy. I think that'll be great. Lucy Led from the Wedgwood Museum will be giving a lecture on Wedgwood advertising. We'll also have a lecture on forgotten Renaissance sources behind Wedgwood designs. This will all be surrounded by good Birmingham food and lots of friendship and fun. So I hope that you will all go to our website, wedgwoodinternationalseminar.org. It's live. You can sign up for the seminar today, and the program is on the website as well. So I look forward to seeing everyone in April.
So I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for today's lecture. And I just want to put in another plug, if you don't mind. Since our Zoom lectures began in February of 2020, if you can believe it, it's really been our great pleasure to present these lectures free of charge to the public. I just have to say that we would be incredibly, incredibly appreciative if you would consider donating to the WIS Zoom lecture series so that we will be in a position to continue these high-level educational programs. You can easily send a donation directly to our WIS treasurer, or you can do it via PayPal, and that link is a little crazy one, so it's just being put into the chat box so you can copy it. I want to thank Anne and David and especially Matthew for today's presentation. It takes a village. It takes a few of us to put these things together. From a personal point of view, Matthew, this has had to have been one of my all-time favorite lectures. I think this was fabulous. I have a particular interest in dresser for a long time, and I have been studying for forever Victorian art, and this just fits perfectly. So I thank you very much. That was terrific. I hope to see many of you in April in Birmingham at the museum, because as you all know, Anne is the hostess with the mostest. So yeah, you can take full credit. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next time. Bye now.